Welcome to another episode of TheGameSmith, and in today's episode we're going to be turning owl skeleton bones into whale skeleton bones. Oh wait, I'm the owl. How is this going to work? Oh no. October is the most wonderful time in order to get all the ghouls and goblins and graveyard markers and the skeletons and all kinds of wonderful crafting materials in order to make all kinds of creepy things for your game table. In today's episode, we're going to be turning an owl skeleton that I found at the dollar store into whalebone scatter terrain for use in your aquatic adventures.
There are all manner of large skeletons available for this type of craft. The challenge was locating a skeleton big enough and roughly in the right shape to make a whalebone graveyard. I was greatly amused by the skeletal structure of this owl, which is nowhere near correct. The bones for ears and all the bones in the wings and on the tail made me laugh. Even these feet, though dramatically out of scale, are very useful, just not for this build. I think it's kind of funny that this skeleton has as much in common with an owl as it does with a whale. Our first order of business is to take the owl apart. Fortunately, it's very easy to disassemble. The only tool that I need is a Phillips head screwdriver, and I can remove all the screws to get to the parts I want to use on this build. These wings have some great bones that I can use for ribs. I just need to cut the plastic parts into the usable pieces. I can use a pair of tin snips in order to cut the parts up. I think I'll also cut off some of the more mechanical looking parts of the ribcage. I'm going to be using this cork hot pot stand from the dollar store as a base. A good place to start is figuring out how much room I'm actually going to need for my ribcage bones. Then with a pair of scissors I can cut the cork to the size that I want. I want to remove the rounded edges so I can actually make the base look more stone-like. I can pick off the edge pieces in order to get the look that I want. Now I'll trace out the ribs so that I know how much space that I have to work with on the base. Now I'll use some other cork in order to build up some features on the base in order to make it look more interesting. I'll use an epoxy glue like E6000, which I know will work great with cork. I'm using a different cork for this than the pieces that I removed from the cork mat. I have these left over from previous builds. Because I'm working on several builds at once here, I ran out of the thick cork, so I'm using this thinner version. I want to create a few features that are under the rib cage, but I have to make sure that I stay below the height of the ribs and away from the edges as well. It will help to periodically check my work with the skeleton so that I know it will all fit later on. I'm also going to create another type of base so that I can make use of those wing bones. I think I want to create a flat bottom on these bones, so I'll have to cut them so that they're all flat and even on their bases. I definitely don't want to make them all the same size, I just want the bottom flat. Now to make sure these ribs stick to the base, I'm going to carve a trough down the middle of the cork. This will give the glue some texture to adhere to. Next I want to organize my plastic wing bones into ribs. I'll organize them largest to smallest, even though that's not how the bones are actually organized in a whale rib cage. Besides, I'm going for the illusion of a boneyard and not an anatomically correct skeleton. I'll put some hot glue on our cork base and then push the rib bone down into place. I'll need some aggregate in order to help secure our bones. I'll also use a craft stick to push the hot glue and the aggregate around. I don't want to burn myself. Now I'll have to hold the bones in place and blow on the glue so that it'll harden quicker. If you have a fan blowing on your build nearby, that could also be helpful. Then I'll repeat this process until all the bones are in place. The ribs shouldn't actually be touching each other. There should be some space between them. I also want to make sure that the bones are leaning forward a bit, to give the illusion that they're slightly curved. If you've seen our videos here at TheGameSmith before, you're probably familiar with our Mod Podge and paint mixture. We want to mix a 60-40 or 50-50 mixture of Mod Podge and dark gray paint. It's very important that we pay close attention to the edges of our base. The mixture will reinforce the cork since the edges are a bit fragile. Don't paint the mixture on too thick though, we don't want to lose any of that awesome texture on our cork. Next I'm going to add some texture by sprinkling some decorative sand on our base. This is particularly important in the large flat areas. However, we don't want to overdo it and camouflage the texture of the cork itself. Once our first layer of Mod Podge is dry, we want to add a second layer. Not only will this bond the decorative sand to our base, but it'll also reinforce the cork even further. Now we need this base to be completely dry before we can work with it again. Next, we're going to use the same turquoise paint we've been using throughout Series 3 in order to add a dry brush to our bases. And just like our other projects, we're using this simple dry brushing technique in order to highlight the surface textures of our build. Please check out our Foundation Series video on dry brushing for a detailed description of this technique. Moving on to the next part of our project, we're going to use a simple nail file or emery board in order to sharpen up the edges of our bones. We don't need all of the edges to be perfectly smooth, but I don't want any big gawky plastic flashing hanging off either. The hole in the ribs where the wing was attached will take a little more work. I don't have to smooth away the edges of the hole entirely, but I can't exactly leave a mechanical looking hole behind either. Next, I want to deal with these other holes in our bones. On the underside, you can see that our bones are concave. Thankfully, I'm ignoring this since the underside will be hidden in the final build. If this feature was exposed, I'd really want to fill them in with something. On the top side of our ribs, we have these little exposed holes, and I want to deal with those. To do this, I'm going to use kitchen and bathroom caulking. All I have to do is squeeze the caulking in and smooth it over with a craft stick. You could easily use modeling clay or hot glue or green stuff or whatever you'd like in order to cover these over. Once the caulking is dry, we can smooth out the surface with a nail file. Once again, it doesn't need to be completely smooth, you just need to get rid of that mechanical feature. Next, we're going to paint our bones because the plastic doesn't look much like bone. We want to use an off-white, not a true or solid white, which is too bright. Instead, we want to use an off-white like this antique white or even this Craftsmart vanilla. Given the camera lights, I'm not entirely sure you can see the off-white of the vanilla. When our off-white is done, we want to add a brown wash to our bones. I really like this Seraphim Sepia from Citadel. You can make your own brown wash or use another brand as you prefer. Now I'm going to use this acrylic paint right from the bottle. I don't want to thin it out or it'll weaken the hold on the plastic I'm painting. Now in painting the bones this way, I'm not really trying to create a realistic skeleton. I'm only trying to create a high contrast, almost cartoony or comic book-like color scheme on our bones. I want the bones to really stand out at the table, so I'm overemphasizing them with the painting choices I've made. If you want to create a realistic skeleton, there are plenty of other content creators on YouTube that are excellent resources. Next, we'll use this Seraphim Sepia on our bones. Because this is a wash, it will collect in all the cracks and the crevices and give us a bony illusion. After your wash is dried, you may want to add another layer, or use a green wash to simulate the algae that covers shipwrecks, as you prefer. Next, we're going to use some wax paper in order to help with our hot glue. Hot glue doesn't stick to wax paper very well, so we're going to use that to our advantage. Using a piece of cardboard, we tape a sheet of wax paper to it in order to create a work surface. We're also going to need some aggregate. All I did was add some decorative sand and rocks together in order to create this mixture. I recommend at least 3 different sizes of decorative pebbles, sand, or fish tank rocks. You don't want all of your particulates in your aggregate to be uniform. Now my plan for this stage of the build is to simulate that our ribs are buried in the seabed. As a result, we have to prepare the inside of our ribcage just as we would prepare the outside. Just so that I'm clear, if we place our bones on the base, how are we going to actually build up the interior? We have to build up our visible interior surfaces before we attach the ribs to our base. And that's what our wax paper work surface is for. We start by adding some hot glue to the interior of our ribcage, but only in a small area. Then we add our aggregate to the glue. While the glue is still quite hot, we dump the ribcage on its side. Then with a craft stick, we push the aggregate back into the hot glue. Gravity will pull the aggregate and the hot glue down onto the wax paper in order to create a flat surface. After a minute, we can turn our build up in order to make sure that our decorative rocks have taken hold. And with a craft stick, we can make adjustments while the glue cools. We repeat this process as many times as needed in order to cover the interior surfaces that we're going to see from the outside of the ribcage. We end up with the wonderful textured surface that will disguise our plastic interior. Next, we take our Mod Podge and paint mixture and coat the interior of our build. We want to reinforce the hot glue's grip on our aggregate so none of the pebbles fall off later. We need to be careful to keep the mixture off the areas we don't want covered. If you end up with the Mod Podge on the build, just use a wet brush to quickly remove it. Then use a dry brush in order to soak up the wet area. You may want to use 2 different sized brushes while painting the interior aggregate. A large brush for the bulky areas and a smaller tip brush for the details like the edges. Once the Mod Podge is completely dry, we can dry brush it. And we use the turquoise-like paint once again. You want to keep your saturation or coverage the same as you did on the base. When you put the 2 parts together, you don't want them to look different at the table. Next, we're going to switch our attention to the decorative details. We've used pasta in several videos in order to create coral. Whichever type of pasta you use, make sure that you coat it with Mod Podge in order to reinforce it. I also recommend that you use a variety of colors so that your build is vibrant and colorful. I'm going to highlight this dark green coral with a light green accent. You could also use a complementary or analogous color, which we talked about in episode 2 of our water accessory series. I'll put a link to the video in the corner. While we still have our wax paper work surface, we can make a few stands of tube coral. Since I don't know where I'm going to place the final decorations on our base, I want to build them separately. We've made these tube pasta coral pieces in recent videos. The only difference here is that I'm gluing the pasta together rather than to a base. I can use the same paint mixture on these pieces as well. I just want to make sure that I completely cover them since I don't know where I'm going to place them yet. Next, I'll just add a yellow accent to the crown of the pasta coral. Once the paint is dry, it should be easy enough to remove the coral from the wax paper. Hopefully you'll be left with a clean base just like this. Now we're going to use these little shells and some E6000 to start decorating our base. We want to focus only on the areas that will be under the ribcage. I think I've found a good spot for that pasta coral. I keep laying the ribcage over the base so I know how the accents under it will look. This will also show me how much room I have left to work with. I think I have room for another large stand of coral here, and I can also place other pasta coral. You may remember these plastic plants that we added to our pasta coral from other videos. I keep reusing these elements because I like them so much, and they're cheap and easy to find. Now the time has come to attach our ribcage to the base. To do that, I'm just going to use some hot glue on the plastic ribcage. I want to get the hot glue on all the surfaces that are going to be in contact with the base. Once I get the ribcage in position, I need to hold it down for a few minutes in order to ensure the glue gets a good grip. Now we can take a look at where the bones are not in contact with the base. We want to fill in these gaps and those at the ends of our bones. We'll just use our hot glue gun and pour aggregate over the glue. We can wait a few seconds for the glue to take hold, and then we can pour off the excess stone. We just work our way around the build in order to fill in all the gaps. With a craft stick, we can just press the aggregate into the glue. When we're done, we can just dump all the excess stones out. You may want to use tweezers or a craft knife in order to remove the few pebbles that got wedged into the build. Now with a small brush, we want to add our final layer of Mod Podge paint mixture. Again, be careful when painting near the bones in order to avoid excessive cleanup. Once the Mod Podge is dry, we add our turquoise dry brush. The paint goes on quite bright, but it will darken up as it dries due to the darker undercoat. We can switch to a smaller brush and get all those little details that we missed earlier. It's also a lot easier to get the small brush between the ribs so that we can dry brush the rocks inside our build. Now the last step of our build is to add all our final decorative accents. We want to place tiny shells around at random locations. We can also add the painted pasta coral at random spots as well. You need only be mindful of packing too much detail into a small area. The goal is to make our accent terrain look like a thriving ecosystem, not an underwater junkyard. We remove the last few hot glue wisps, and our whalebone scatter terrain is complete. This build was a bit of a logistical challenge, which I found quite enjoyable. Figuring out how to create the different elements of the build in the proper sequence was a challenge, until I remembered seeing an exploded view of a sailing ship. Each of the parts was in the picture, but removed and connected with a dotted line. The order you put the parts together affected the final product. I just followed that idea. If you'd like to support what we're doing here at the GameSmith, please hit the subscribe button. If you're already a subscriber, please hit the thumbs up button and leave a comment. You might also check out our blog at thegamesmith.org. We post the building materials for all our crafts on our website too. You might also check us out on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. Until next time, I'll see you at the table.